Ladies and gentlemen, may I begin by thanking the EPP Group of the European Parliament and the European Ideas Network for the invitation to participate in this important conference. I regret that I cannot be physically with you, but rejoice that modern technology can bridge the tyranny of distance. I hope that my remarks from a different country with different economic parameters will provide a counterpoint to your important discussions. In making my observations, I do so as an outsider, not imbued in the day-to-day policy making of the continent. Nonetheless, I hope that these perspectives help to shine a light on the challenges facing Europe, many of which we share elsewhere in the world. Secondly, my observations accept that the global financial crisis has occurred and are not about attributing blame. I also note that while most nations have introduced stimulus measures, the type of expenditure has varied considerably. I'm not proposing to debate which was more effective, although I have my own views, but to accept the position that nations find themselves in today. Before turning to the response to the current economic situation, it's worth noting a number of matters. First, although the expression global financial crisis is commonly used to describe the situation, the crisis is primarily one involving Western nations. Many nations will experience GDP growth, especially those connected to China. Secondly, the crisis is largely one of capital availability. And thirdly, the failure was of prudence and governance, not of capitalism itself. Unless the real causes are understood, we are unlikely to respond appropriately. And finally, the crisis should not disguise pre-existing challenges facing many nations, especially in Europe, some of which I now turn to. As an observer, Europe faces three significant challenges. One is immediate, and the others of medium and longer term duration. Each is related. Let me explain. The first challenge is the immediate social consequence of the crisis, namely rising unemployment, especially amongst the young and the unskilled. It's estimated that 15.2 million people were unemployed in Europe in August, a figure that is certain to soar in the coming year. And more than 5 million young people are unemployed, with a youth unemployment rate of almost 20%. This follows a period of more than a decade during which Europe's unemployment levels have remained well above the OECD average. This in turn will increase pressure on state expenditure, which is already dangerously high in many nations. Moreover, government expenditure in Europe was already higher than many comparable nations, including the OECD average. There is an economic and moral case to ensure that as many young people can enter or return to the workforce as soon as possible. Now, while the rate of return will be governed in part by external factors, such as the recovery in trade, it is also dependent upon domestic policy decisions. Most important of these will be the readiness of young people for work, the incentives for them to do so and the disincentives to remain on welfare, and the ability of businesses to employ them. This suggests a number of initiatives. First, nations need to reinvigorate their skills training for young people. Importantly, skills cannot be taught in isolation, but need to integrate education and on-the-job experience. The German apprentice model, which has been successfully modified elsewhere, including in Australia, is one approach that has proven successful. It could be revivified. Secondly, there's a need to ensure that education is relevant to the current and future workforce requirements. IT skills, for example, are prerequisites for many jobs. They need to be integrated into school curricula where this isn't done adequately. Thirdly, businesses need incentives to take on young people as trainees. This is an investment in the future. In Australia, schemes include subsidies for apprentices and assistance in their provision of their tools. Incentives could also be extended to family enterprises in Europe. Fourthly, disincentives to work and incentives to remain on welfare need to be removed. If the welfare system implicitly taxes low-skilled workers, for example, it will discourage them from finding a job. A work-first approach to welfare is required. The second ongoing challenge involves the rapid ageing of the population in Europe. As the continent recovers from the crisis, it will face the need to counter relatively rapid depopulation. Unless nations are willing to accept very high levels of immigration, it will be necessary to ensure that the maximum number of residents is adequately trained and able to participate in the paid workforce. The worst of all scenarios would be for Europe to find itself with a larger, older population dependent upon a smaller, inadequately trained workforce and/or significant numbers of people of working age on welfare. It would be necessary for European policymakers to look beyond popular notions of the European model or the American model to policies that deliver employment outcomes if social dissatisfaction and the possible consequent radicalism is to be avoided in coming decades. This leads me to suggest that longer-term structural issues ultimately must be addressed. In particular, Europe has tended to trail behind other regions in reaching GDP peaks, but then tends to fall to lower levels for a longer period of time. In other words, the cycle of GDP growth has tended to be shallower than in other economic regions, although obviously there are significant variations from country to country in Europe. The third challenge relates to government expenditure. Europe as a whole tends to spend more on government activity than any other comparable nations and regions. This will present significant challenges to nations already facing increased unemployment and an ageing of their populations. However, it will be necessary to tackle this problem over the medium term. If not done, European nations will be in a more weakened position when any future financial downturn occurs. Let me then turn to the long-term challenge for Europe. A leading economist at a major Australian think tank recently asked, "Does Europe still matter?" While the question initially may seem impertinent to you, he was asking it in the context that Europe is still the destination for 10% of Australia's merchandise exports, and that Europe accounts for almost 16% of total Australian trade, which is still higher than China's 15%. His concern, and that of other Australian commentators, is that Europe's weakness will have a detrimental impact on Australia and may well offset any benefits of the Chinese recovery. A number of observations can be made. First, the nations that enter financial downturns in a healthy economic state are more likely to survive and emerge more quickly and in a better condition. Secondly, the task of structural economic reform remains urgent. The lazy response is to blame all the ills of an economy on the recent crisis, whilst ignoring the pre-existing conditions. Reducing the amount of national wealth consumed by the state will be a major challenge for most nations. If this challenge is not tackled, the recovery will be likely to be delayed and in some cases will stall. Growth will be hampered, unemployment will remain stubbornly high with all the social consequences that ensue. While part of the response is to impose appropriate regulation where it's been lacking, this should be matched by recognition that regulatory burdens in Europe are already heavy. Similarly, high marginal tax rates will be a disincentive to the rebuilding necessary in coming years. In the meantime, however, a concentration on education and training for young people will be a necessary response to the immediate challenges facing most nations. I wish you well in your deliberations.